The late afternoon sun lay heavy over the dry plains, painting everything in amber and dust. Caleb Turner rode slowly across the open land, the reins slack in his rough, weathered hands. His old horse, Bramble, knew the way well enough. This was their routine, a lonely circle around the ranch that stretched farther than any man could walk in a day. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, and in the distance, the mesas glowed red like ancient embers. Caleb had spent years in silence. After his wife, Eliza, passed away, he had shut the world out. The ranch was all he had left, and even that felt too big for one man. He talked to the cattle sometimes, or to the wind if it was blowing right. Mostly, though, he listened, to the creak of wood, the rustle of grass, the long, aching quiet. He was heading for the north pasture when he noticed something odd, a shape near the old cottonwood tree that stood alone by the ridge. From a distance, it looked like a scrap of cloth fluttering in the wind. Caleb frowned. No one came this far onto his land anymore, not even stray riders. He nudged Bramble forward, the sound of hoofbeats breaking the stillness. As he drew closer, the feeling in his chest tightened. It wasn't just cloth, it was movement, a faint, trembling motion. The horse snorted, uneasy, and Caleb swung down from the saddle. The air felt heavier now, thick with something he couldn't name. Near the base of the tree stood a young girl. Her clothes were torn, her dark hair tangled with leaves and dust. She couldn't have been more than 14, maybe 15, and she looked as though she'd been through days of fear. Her wrists were raw, as if she'd been bound. She leaned weakly against the trunk, her breath shallow, her eyes distant and guarded. Caleb froze, unsure what to say or do. She was Apache. He could tell from the beadwork still clinging to a strip of her dress, from the proud shape of her face even under all that fear. He'd seen their people before, though not often. Tension between settlers and native tribes had been high for years, too much blood had been spilled on both sides. But she was just a girl, wounded, exhausted, and alone. He stepped closer, moving slow, careful not to startle her. "You all right, miss?" he asked softly. Her eyes flicked up to him, dark and full of mistrust. She said nothing, just stared. Caleb noticed then the wooden sign nailed to the tree beside her. The words were burned into the wood, rough and uneven, "White man don't forgive." The message chilled him. It wasn't a warning for her. It was a message meant to be seen by others, maybe even by him. He looked from the sign back to the girl. Whoever had done this wanted her shamed or hurt, wanted to make a cruel example of her. He swallowed hard, anger burning low in his chest. "Who did this to you?" he asked. No answer. She just hugged her torn shawl tighter around herself and shook her head faintly. Caleb set his hat back on his head and looked around. There were hoofprints in the dirt, fresh ones, maybe only hours old. Whoever left her here had ridden off fast. He sighed. There was no one else coming for her, that much was clear. "You're safe now," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she believed him. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." The girl's legs wobbled when she tried to stand straight. Caleb took off his coat, a rough brown duster, and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, then stood still as he wrapped it snug. The coat looked far too big on her small frame, but at least it would keep her warm. He crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Can you walk?" She hesitated, then nodded once. Caleb led her to the horse, his hand steady on her back. When she saw the animal, she froze again, looking ready to run. "Easy, now," he murmured. "He's gentle." He helped her up, and she clung to the saddle horn as though she hadn't been on a horse in a long time. Caleb climbed up behind her and turned Bramble toward the ranch. The ride back was quiet except for the creak of leather and the sound of her breathing. The sky was deepening into violet when they reached his cabin. It was small and rough, built from pine and patched in places, but it was home. He lifted her down, careful and slow, and opened the door. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and coffee hung in the air. "Sit down there by the stove," he said gently. "You'll warm up faster." She obeyed, still silent, still watching him like he might turn on her any second. Caleb lit a lamp, the yellow light spilling across the room. He poured water into a pot and set it to boil, then reached for a can of beans and a few potatoes. When the food was cooking, he finally spoke again. Name's Caleb Turner. This here's my place. He paused. You got a name? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted toward the window, toward the last sliver of sunset over the plains. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't speak at all. Then, barely louder than a whisper, she said, Noya. The sound of it seemed to fill the little cabin. Caleb gave a small nod, trying not to show the relief he felt just hearing her voice. That's a fine name, he said softly. When the soup was ready, he handed her a bowl. She looked at it suspiciously at first, then took a cautious sip. Her hands trembled, but she finished it all. Caleb sat across from her, elbows on his knees, studying her face in the flickering lamplight. She was young, but there was something old in her eyes, something that had seen too much. He wanted to ask more, to know who had hurt her, where her family was. But the words, "White man don't forgive," echoed in his mind, and he stayed quiet. When she finished eating, she pulled the coat tighter and leaned back against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut. She looked small there, almost weightless. Caleb stood, threw another log on the fire, and watched the sparks rise. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. Caleb looked toward the tree line, where the cottonwood stood somewhere out in the dark. The sign would still be there, swaying in the wind, a grim reminder of how cruel people could be. He turned back to the girl. You can rest here, he said quietly. No one's gonna bother you tonight. She didn't answer, but her breathing slowed, and before long she was asleep. Caleb sat by the window long into the night, listening to the wind and thinking about the words carved into that sign. He'd lived alone because it was easier that way. No pain, no trouble, no debts to the past. But now, there was a frightened girl asleep under his roof, and a message burned into wood that seemed meant for him. As the lamp flickered low, he muttered to himself, "Forgive or not, I ain't turning her away." Then he closed his eyes and let the quiet settle once more, the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Morning came slowly, with a pale band of light crawling over the hills and spilling into the valley below. The air was cold enough to see your breath, and the only sound was the low groan of wood as the ranch began to wake. Caleb Turner stepped out onto the porch, mug of coffee steaming in his hands, and watched the horizon the way a man watches for something he doesn't quite expect but can't stop hoping for. Inside the cabin, the girl, Noya, was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket beside the stove. She hadn't said much since the night before, but she hadn't run either, and that meant something. Caleb wasn't sure what to do next. He wasn't a man used to company, much less a wounded child from a people most of the territory had turned against. But there she was, and she needed someone. By the time the sun cleared the ridges, Noya stirred. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light. Caleb set down his mug and opened the door. "There's water out back for washing," he said. "And I fixed up some biscuits, if you're hungry." She hesitated, like she was waiting for a trick, then nodded and slipped outside. When she came back in, her hair was damp and combed back, her face cleaner though still streaked with dust. Caleb poured her a cup of warm milk, and for the first time, she met his eyes without flinching. "Feel any better?" he asked. Noya nodded faintly. "Better," she said, her voice still soft but steadier now. Caleb smiled, a small thing but real. "That's good. You can stay here a while, till you're strong again." She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket. "Why?" He blinked. "Why what? Why you help me?" she asked. Her tone wasn't angry, just confused, cautious, as if the very idea of kindness was something foreign. Caleb stared at the fire for a moment before answering. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "Ain't no other reason worth mentioning." Noya didn't reply, but the lines of tension around her shoulders eased just a little. She ate her biscuit in silence, and when she finished, she wandered to the window. From there, she could see the long stretch of land rolling toward the hills, dotted with thorn bushes and pale grass. For a while, she just stood there, watching. Days passed like that, quiet, slow, filled with small moments that said more than words. Caleb taught her how to feed the chickens, how to gather wood without getting splinters, how to patch a torn shirt. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it came suddenly, lighting her whole face like the first fire after a long storm. Still, something in her eyes stayed distant. Sometimes Caleb would catch her staring toward the north, the direction of the old hills, her expression unreadable. One morning, he woke to find her gone from the cabin. Panic struck him hard. He saddled Bramble and rode north, following the faint prints her bare feet had left in the dirt. He found her near the cottonwood tree, the same one where he'd first seen her. She was kneeling by a small pile of stones, stacked carefully as though marking something sacred. The sign that once hung there was gone. Caleb had taken it down and burned it days ago. But the memory of it still lingered in the wind. Noya didn't turn when he approached. She was whispering something in her own language, her hands pressed together. Caleb dismounted and waited a few feet away, not wanting to intrude. When she finished, she stood slowly and faced him. "This was where my brother died," she said quietly. Her English was halting, but the words were clear enough. "They made him dig the hole, then left him here." Caleb's chest tightened. He had no words for that kind of pain. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't know." Noya's eyes shone with tears that she refused to let fall. "White men did this. The soldiers. They said my people stole their cattle. But we didn't." Caleb nodded, his throat dry. "Some men, they see what they want to see. Don't make it right." She looked at him then, searching his face for something, truth, maybe, or guilt. "You are white," she said. He met her gaze without looking away. "I am. And you still help me." "I help because what they did ain't who I am," Caleb said firmly. "I can't change the past, but I can choose what kind of man I am right now." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the wind whispering through the grass around them. Then Noya nodded, a small motion but full of meaning. They rode back together, neither speaking much. But when they reached the cabin, Noya didn't go straight inside. She lingered by the fence, watching the horses. Finally, she asked, "You live alone a long time?" "Too long," Caleb said. "I thought it was easier that way. Turns out it ain't." She gave a tiny smile. "My mother said no one is meant to live without a fire near them." Caleb chuckled softly. "Your mother was a wise woman." As days turned into weeks, Noya began to heal, not just her body, but something deeper. She laughed once in a while, helped Caleb mend fences, and even sang softly when she thought he wasn't listening. Caleb built her a small room off the side of the cabin, a place that was hers. He carved her name into the door with his knife, steady and careful, like setting down a promise. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Noya broke the quiet. "When I am strong, I will find my people," she said. "They think I am dead." Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll help you," he said. Her eyes widened. "You would do that?" He nodded again. "You deserve to go home." She looked out over the horizon, where the sky burned gold and red. "The sign on the tree," she whispered. "It said white men don't forgive. But maybe some do." Caleb didn't answer right away. He stared at the fading light, remembering all the anger he'd carried since losing his wife, all the years he'd chosen silence over life. "Maybe forgiveness goes both ways," he said finally. "Maybe it's something we both gotta learn." Noya turned to him, and for the first time, her eyes were calm, not afraid, not hardened, just clear. "Maybe so," she said. As the last light faded and the stars began to show, the lonely rancher and the young Apache girl sat side by side on the porch. The land around them was still scarred by history, but for the first time, it felt like something new was beginning to grow, something fragile but real. Caleb didn't know what the future would bring, or whether he'd ever see her people, but he knew this: he'd found a reason to keep living, to keep trying. And somewhere deep inside, Noya had found a small corner of peace in a world that had taken so much from her. The night deepened, and the prairie stretched wide and endless before them. The wind carried the scent of rain, and for the first time in years, Caleb Turner didn't feel alone anymore.